Hey, Matt Bianco here. You know, one of the things I love most about classical conversations and the classical method of education is talking about big ideas, talking about great literature, good questions, theology, philosophy. I mean, all of the different things that we get to talk about. Over the last 2 years, I've had the experience of doing that with a Challenge 3 class and now a Challenge 4 class. And actually the same group of kids, I moved up with them. And let me just say how much I love those kids and the conversations we've had. A couple weeks ago, we went up to Virginia for an end of the year event, kind of a quasi-protocol event. We went and watched Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, but we met up with two or three other challenge groups. And at that event, I learned something about Socratic dialogues that I don't know that I would have discovered on my own in my smaller group of 8. We were having a campfire, a bonfire the night before, you know, marshmallows, s'mores, the whole 9 yards. Probably 40 to 50 students, most of them challenge 3 or 4, a handful of challenge A and 1. And the idea was, well, let's get something started about Julius Caesar because that's the play we're going to go see the next day. So we're sitting around this fire, and I had been elected or appointed or voluntold to lead this discussion. And so I jumped up on there was a stump there and realized that I didn't know what was going, you know, who these people were, what they had read, what they had done. And so I had to ask very basic questions. Who's read Julius Caesar? Have you read any of Shakespeare's plays? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? What is the story about? And we're going through the conversation, and we get to this kind of point where one of the participants just volunteers and says, I think the play Julius Caesar can be summed up with one word: rhetoric. And then somebody else says, no, I think it can be summed up with one word: patriotism. Another one says, no, ambition. At this point now, I'm just calling on people to speak, right? They're almost controlling the conversation at this point. So they decide that they want to dig deeper into the statement that the play can be summed up with the word rhetoric. So I asked them to define rhetoric. And so somebody throws out a definition. And then I ask if there's any competing definitions. Somebody throws out another definition. Now I realize I've got some place where I can create a little bit of division. And this is important for the conversation.
If it only qualifies as rhetoric when it's used to persuade to truth, you're on this side of the fire. But if it qualifies as rhetoric when you're using it for good or evil, you're on this side of the fire.
One side says it's only rhetoric if it's being used for good. The other side says that rhetoric is more generic and can be used to persuade toward the good, the true, and the beautiful, or can be used to manipulate the masses for evil. And then there's a group, just a small group of people in the middle that haven't decided. So I asked them some clarifying questions, we clarify some of the definitions, and then eventually everybody's split up into 2 groups, almost evenly split. So as we proceed to the next step, I asked them, okay, well, now that we know what your definition is and what your definition is, why don't you tell me what you both agree on? So they agree that rhetoric is the art of persuasion. And then I asked, is there more to that definition that we can add that you would still both agree on? Essentially at that point, I'm able to just step back and moderate a discussion because they end up taking over the conversation. They've got it to this point. If I had forced the conversation, I probably still would be talking about something in Julius Caesar. You know, should Brutus have assassinated Caesar? Which would have all been good conversations, but letting them find where they want to dig into, they got to this point, a truth that is very worth discussing that I might not have thought to discuss.
We both sides agree that persuasion is our common ground. Were there not people in history, throughout history, persuaded for good and evil?
The difficult point it goes into there is, you know, Hitler thought that what he was doing was good. Every tyrant, or most tyrants, thought that they had a good cause behind each of the things they did. So rhetoric was used for good according to their own personal definition of rhetoric.
Personally, I make the distinguishment between rhetoric and oratory. Oratory, I believe, is simply the articulation of an idea or a philosophy or a belief system, right? That's political speeches, that's tyrant speeches, that's whatever you want it to be, right? Rhetoric, I believe, goes a little bit beyond oratory in the fact that I believe its goal or its purpose is to lead to capital T truth.
Maybe the rhetoric that we're saying could be used for evil, if we're saying rhetoric could be used for evil, is not rhetoric, because if they really were using all 5 canons of rhetoric, it would lend themselves to truth.
It's a built-in mechanism to prevent itself from being used in the wrong way. If you use the whole of it, is that what you're saying? When I see movement,
Yeah, I know. I'm thinking.
And 2 hours later, we let the conversation end. The challenge tutors made a couple of comments, remarks, complimenting the group, and then we just watched them splinter out into little groups and continue the conversation for the next hour. The next morning at breakfast, still having the conversation. That Sunday after church, I went out to lunch with a group of the kids and still having the conversation. It was just amazing to see the excitement that came out of that. So what I learned from teaching this larger group, or leading rather, this larger group that I want to take back to my smaller group, starting out with basic questions, getting them talking about the background of the story, the plot line of the story, whatever, what's going on, just characters, basic stuff. In fact, plot might even be too deep at this point. Very basic stuff to get their thinking juices flowing, to get the words flowing off their tongue, to get everybody participating and involved is important. All too often, I begin the conversation thinking about where I want it to go, where I'm trying to get them to discover a truth that's important to me. I need to let them guide the conversation to what they need, to the truth that they need at that point in their lives, and that point in their conversation, that point in their thought, their thinking process, so that when they discover that truth, that capital T truth, they own it. What I had practiced, but it was really more evident there because I split the room up, they were physically, geographically separated from one another, was that idea of making them pick a dogma and running with it. There's this idea in our education that we can be unbiased when we approach a topic, and it's a fallacy of education. By getting them to dig their heels in and to establish the dogma for which they were going to argue, allowed the conversation to dig much, much deeper. But they didn't have to stick with it. As one side would make arguments, people would switch over. Sometimes people switch 2 or 3 times throughout the course of the conversation. And other folks, they would be on one side, they would hear an argument that they liked from the other side, and they would say, oh, that's almost got me. I just need to think through this a little bit more. Help me. It would be false to think of that as that side losing and this side winning. It's not a team that's winning, it's the truth that's winning. And then what I learned too was helping them to love their neighbors, right? Because some of those kids are more talkative. They want to talk. And getting them to remember, okay, I'm going to hold back a little bit because my neighbor needs to share. And then those quieter kids, reminding them that, hey, you have something worth sharing. And your friends and your classmates and your neighbors here want to know what that is. Love them by sharing that with them. And then finally, emphasizing the spirit of inquiry, because that's what we ultimately want to grow in our students. In this experience with the campfire, this 40, 50 kids, there were a couple of kids who would shout out things like, what's the right answer? What is rhetoric? Which of these two groups is right? What do you say to that? If I tell them the answer, what I think the answer is, then they didn't learn how to think through it themselves. I just became Google for them. My goal is to develop that spirit of inquiry and the ability to seek out truth. And so what I told them, I don't know. That's why we need to have this conversation, and emphasize the inquisitiveness, the questions, the restatements, the conversation that they were having. There is that desire sometimes to just say, well, this is what you should be saying right here. This is what you should be thinking right here. And I need to love my neighbor by holding back that stuff myself so that the spirit of inquiry can be nurtured in them. And this just re-emphasizes why I love the dialectic, Socratic conversations, and classical conversations for doing it this way, for teaching us and helping us to do it this way. That's why I love this.